Welcome to the Prison Pod, a podcast for all people experiencing incarceration. The mission of this podcast is to save lives, restore hope, reduce suffering, and recidivism. Many show ideas come directly from the listeners, so please write the host. Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine, 04473. Here is your host, Ms. Valerie.
Well, hello and welcome back to the Prison Pod. Today we have a great guest joining us. Perrin is coming all the way from the UK, 3,000 miles away. He's joining us from the University of Birmingham. Good morning. Well, good afternoon, Christian.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Valerie. How are you?
Great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. I want to jump right in and ask you a little bit about the work you do at the university first.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I teach a BSc undergraduate psychology degree with a bunch of fabulous colleagues, both in the UK and in Dubai. We have a Dubai campus, so I kind of teach out there too. And I teach specifically on two modules for the undergraduate program, which is crime and antisocial behavior. I also teach on a social psychology module, which is kind of a critical social psychology module looking at kind of our responses to contemporary issues in society. And then I will be teaching soon on an MSc module in mental health, much of which focuses on mental health in forensic settings. So a lot of my teaching at the university surrounds kind of the intersection between social psychology, criminal justice, mental health, and kind of matters of kind of responses to crime.
Right up my alley. So I became familiar with you from Stephen Matthew Clark with the Awakening Exchange, and I'm curious how you got involved with the Awakening since you're on the other side of the world.
Yeah, it's a lovely story actually. So I guess I'll go back right to the start. So when I first graduated in criminology, I worked for a while as a volunteer for a charity in the UK called the Samaritans. The Samaritans is the UK's foremost leading charity in reducing suicide, looking to help individuals suffering with distress, despair, and suicidal ideation. So I was working initially, taking calls from individuals in the community who would call up and, be greeted by an empathetic volunteer who wanted to help them explore what they were going through. And because at the time I had a degree in criminology, in the way that charities work to try to mobilize any asset that individuals have, they wanted me to explore an opportunity to collaborate with two local prisons. And the idea was, if you're in prison, you're about 8 times more likely to attempt to take your own life than you are in the general population. So we know that suicide, self-harm, and mental illness generally in prison is far more of an entrenched issue. So we had, I guess, an ethical duty to have a presence in prisons. So I ended up taking the Samaritan service ultimately into 2 prisons in the UK. So what that meant was I was working with individuals serving time, training them on becoming listeners, volunteer listeners, so they could listen to other inmates and support them with their feelings of distress, despair, and suicidal feelings. Because, of course, if you're serving time in prison, you might not want to go to the prison officer to get your kind of mental health support. So that's how my kind of journey into forensic psych and into kind of prison-based work began. But then for a master's degree, I did some research on that program, published a paper looking at peer support in prison and listener programs in the prison. So I basically interviewed some of the chaps who I was working with at that time, and I published that paper in Psychology, Crime and Law. Stephen Matthew Clark at the Awakening Exchange read the paper and got in touch with me because, he felt inspired by it and he wanted to know more about utilizing peer support programs like the Samaritans Listener Scheme in prisons in the US. So I first kind of collaborated with Stephen probably as far back as around 2008 18, maybe. I think that's when he first reached out. So he didn't read the paper right away, but I think he found it around 2017, reached out. We first met in 2018. I obviously loved the work that he was doing with the Awaken Exchange, which is about demystifying corrections and about investing in things like peer support and I guess removing the kind of hegemony away from the carceration system. So yeah, it's been a great sort of partnership, and we work together now to help do just that, to demystify what corrections is like, and to empower individuals both who are serving time and who have recently been released and who are due for release, to kind of recapture and reclaim the people that they intended to be.
Well, you did a really good job describing that. And for those who aren't familiar, the programming that we do with the Awakening Exchange is coming right out of the main state prison. The men are running it right from there. And we have people from all over the world that are joining us to address all of the issues that many of us face during our work. So it's been a great resource for me and many of those that I work with. And I'm sure it has been for you too. And
Yeah.
what you've shared with us has been great.
Yeah, I mean, it's been incredible for bringing people together. It truly is an exchange which is having a great impact. And there is just nothing like it. Certainly not in the UK. It is unheard of for individuals serving time to have access to the internet in the way that Stephen does, and to have a laptop and to be able to connect. And I suppose that for me is part of the utility of the Awaken Exchange, is that it is a bold and deliberate attempt to demystify. And mystification for me is one of the many facets of corrections which stops it from being inclusive, prevents it from being fair, and prevents members of the public from engaging in debates about fairer justice. So yeah, it's doing remarkable things, Stephen, in Awakening Exchange. So it's a great thing, and long may it continue.
I came across a term, and I'm not sure if it was on your LinkedIn or on something else I read, but it intrigued me, and it was psychological flexibility.
Oh yeah. Okay, yeah. It's
Could you explain that?
yeah, for sure. It's a term that is usually connected to acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which is a therapeutic modality founded, I guess, on principles of existentialism, mindfulness, and cognitive behavioral therapy. And psychological flexibility could be considered a state which can be achieved through a more kind of adaptive engagement with some of the struggles that we have, as humans. I guess some people might use the word resilience in a similar context. I personally have a bit of a problem with that word. I think it's been kind of politicized, and I'm not sure I like the idea of resilience, which is often connected to sort of courage and strength. But psychological flexibility is the ability to, despite facing adversity, cultivate wisdom and insight, and to, I suppose, roll with the punches a little bit, to introspect and to flexibly interrogate your experience of your conscious world using techniques like mindfulness, using techniques of self-discovery, techniques like journaling, etc. So, yeah, psychological flexibility is a state to be achieved through interventions like ACT or cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's something that I'm interested in both in my forensic kind of space and in my kind of therapeutic practice.
I like your terminology much better.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing debate actually, and there's quite a lot of there is quite a lot of stringent debate about these terminologies, and I am a bit of a stickler for linguistics, which I know people find annoying, but language is important.
It is important. And we've lost so many of languages over the years, different languages that are no longer spoken.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so now let's get into the good stuff. Let's start talking about your book. I'd like to know, first of all, what prompted you to write the book and what you feel was the most important piece of it.
Yeah, thank you. What prompted me to write it was, I suppose it was the ultimate output from years of research. I'd already done the hard yards in that I'd conducted a lot of research over a period of around 6 years, both in the UK, some in the US, and some in Singapore, actually, in the arena of justice. So I'd worked in around 6 or 7 prisons in the UK, interviewing individuals that were peer support volunteers within prison. So these were people who had taken on voluntary, often, roles to support other prisoners. And that might be in the space of supporting them with mental health, as Samaritan listeners, so listening to other inmates and allowing that space for exploration and kind of mental health support. It might be supporting fellow inmates with educational needs, supporting incarcerated people with personal care, healthcare. So there are so many peer support schemes or programs in prisons in the UK whereby the prisoners themselves are trained and then they volunteer to help fellow peers. And it's not often spoken about very much. We don't know a great deal about it. And in the early days, I was very interested in what it might be like for individuals serving time to become peer supporters. Oftentimes people who wind up in prison have come from, fairly deleterious backgrounds. They've suffered, they've gone through adversity, and to suddenly find themselves in a position where they were doing these altruistic roles as peer supporters might be quite a sort of a turning point for them in their life course. So I was interested in that. And then I kind of did bits of similar research in the US, mainly in kind of parole contexts, and similar research in Singapore, looking at programs like resettlement programs. But what you often find basically is that individuals who've committed crimes and who've got convictions often have this intense desire to give something back and to make wisdom from their experience of having been in prison, and to cultivate wisdom from all the stigmatization that comes with having a criminal record. And they often do that by developing wounded healer roles. They help youths at risk of offending. Individuals with substance misuse histories help other people with substance misuse histories. Those with mental health issues who are in recovery want to help other people who are not yet in recovery. And this is a finding that we see all the time. And my research really wanted to kind of zone in on that, but in the kind of forensic or in the justice space. So yeah, that's what I was interested in. I'd cultivated the research and I'd finished my PhD in 2017, which was on all of that research. And then, it made sense to write a book. The reason why I chose to write a book about it was because I felt like I had more things to say than I did in my PhD. I wanted to make the point that individuals who are incarcerated can really make meaning from their experience despite unfavorable odds, and despite the fact that the brutality of prison doesn't really provide much by way of self-growth. Despite all of that, individuals serving time are able to often cultivate, meaning and purpose through altruistic roles and through interconnection, which I was really kind of fond of speaking about. And I wanted to make, the point that if all of that is true, then we really should start thinking about how we can do justice differently. Prison programs, correctional programs, behavioral programs may not work so well as actually allowing individuals the space and autonomy to discover their own meaning and purpose through interconnection and through active citizenship type roles, supporting other people in distress, etc. So that was the kind of motivation. I felt like I had a lot to say. And then also, people like Stephen, a clerk who've got experience of incarceration were telling me to write it. They'd read a little bit of the research in papers, and they felt it was important that it was going to have an impact. So a little bit of me felt like I had a duty to share the message.
And here we are talking about the book, and we haven't even mentioned the title of it. So,
Yeah.
what is the title of the book?
Yeah, good question. It's funny because I'm finding that I'm kind of quite poor at actually elucidating my own work. It's often easier to talk about other people's, isn't it? But it's the book is entitled. I think I settled finally on peer support in prison is the main running title, and then the subtitle is how incarcerated individuals rebuild their lives through active citizenship. Okay, so that captured it for me, I think, and yeah, I mean, I could caveat all day long, Valerie. I often do this irritating thing where I'm so aware of caveating my own research and some of the messages around it. But I think what I wanted to be very careful of in the book is suggesting that prison can be constructive because prisoners can become active citizens, and they can become peer supporters, develop meaning and purpose, and they can have a constructive experience. And in doing that, remove the obligation and the responsibility of the state to provide a fairer prison system. I think peer support in prison could be construed as kind of rehabilitation on the cheap. Instead of us, the state, investing in better services for individuals who are incarcerated, go and do it yourself kind of thing, which is not the message I wanted to deliver. The message I wanted to deliver in the book was, despite the fact, that prisons are brutal and deprived and deleterious environments, individuals still manage often to cultivate their own meaningful experience. And they do that despite, the abandonment that they suffer at the hands of a coercive state.
You've made some really incredible comments here about the thing active citizenship is just like bouncing around in my brain here because other than Maine and Vermont, I think we're the only states that allow people who are in prison to vote. And, this active citizenship, you
Yeah.
lose so much of that connection to society and your family, everything is circles around the people that you're with in prison. So I've never thought of citizenship in prison,
Yeah.
but that's a really important word,
It is. It is, and it's kind of a risky word to use as well. And I think I was kind of deliberate in using it in a sort of paradoxical way because prisons are miniature, simulated communities. They don't run effectively. We know that, and they are not ideal by any stretch. Contexts for good self-growth work and for preparing people for reintegration. But they are communities, and there are opportunities for individuals to connect and do something meaningful that benefits the kind of citizenry, of the environment that they're in. And there's plenty of proof that people do that, to good effect. And I think if we think of that as possible, we can start to think about how we alter prisons for one, but actually how we move towards abolishing prisons. And for me, that is a tragically bold thing to say. I think when you say that at a conference or you say that in the presence of practitioners, even people who are I guess really trying to divert away from prison are kind of shocked at the idea. And abolitionists, people who really kind of want to think about abolishing prisons themselves are often shocked by the idea and find it, naive or unattainable or whatever. But I feel like we must have the target. We must have the ambition. We must have the vision of abolishing prison. Even if we don't achieve it in my lifetime or the next generation or the one after that, we must have the vision of moving away from this system that repeatedly fails at providing a humanitarian and fair justice and repeatedly fails at restoring and reforming communities. And so for me, citizenship is a core part of that. How do we make prison, if we have to, a place which is more about kind of humanity and more about active citizenship and reciprocity and empathy and restoration, and in order so that we can then think about, well, do we actually need prison in the way that we've constructed it over the last few centuries? Could we move towards therapeutic community types of establishments, and can we gently move towards diverting away from prison entirely? And can we move towards community-based programs which are much more kind of inherent within the community and much more restorative? But for me, I think it starts with proving that prisons can at least invest in programs that are about empowering individuals that are serving time rather than kind of punishing them.
Especially when you look at a lot of the people that have come into the system come from a trauma-filled background. And that is very hard to develop as you're growing up, when you're living with trauma. And then coming into the prison system, we have the trauma. And then on top of that, you add the stigma, because this is the thing that bothers me more than anything else. I see people come out, they've been out 10, 12, 14 years, and all someone has to do is run their name in a Google search, and all that nasty stuff comes up, and that replaces all the work they've done. It's like people change their opinion immediately because look what they did, rather than look at what they've done.
Yeah. Yeah, and I kind of talk a little bit in the book about degradation rituals, and if you think about what happens when an individual commits a crime, there is a response, and that response is usually characterized by a bunch of, degradation rituals. The individual is purposely, ritualistically, and ceremoniously degraded, and it starts with arrest, conviction, lots of processing, a court appearance potentially. Court is very ceremonious, it's very symbolic, it's very frightening. There's language and linguistics that are used that are confusing, to the lay person. All of that seems quite a deliberate act of law and symbolism, of punishment. And the rituals go on through prison and reintegration and probation. And of course, the person gets a criminal record, and that's shared with people. There are so many rituals that degrade the individual as a human. And often those degradation rituals are long-lasting, if not permanent. As you say, you can always dig up the dirt on someone's past. And we need to do better. Shad Maruna asks the question, about reintegration rituals, re-entry as a rite of passage. We spend so much time degrading people in these ceremonious ways, but once they've served a sentence, we don't have any reintegration rituals. We don't have any forgiveness rituals. We don't have any, welcome back to the fold, kind of ceremonies. We don't recognize people's achievements and movements away from crime, but we do spend a lot of time degrading them. And part of that degradation, is permanent criminal records and sanctions that might come with that. I met a chap in Chicago, Paul Rothschild, who's on LinkedIn. What's his company name? I can't quite remember, which is totally useless of me, but it's about combating permanent punishments. The coalition, the Chicago Coalition for combating or ending permanent punishments. I think that's it. Really inspirational chap. We talked for hours about the levels of permanent punishments that exist. Once an individual commits a crime, and I could talk for ages on it, but I think philosophically and pragmatically, it's absurd. It's absurd to think that We can reintegrate individuals that were actually invested in community reintegration, that were invested in allowing somebody to re-enter, or whatever prefix re-term you want to use, society, while at the same time punishing them permanently with a criminal record that doesn't get expunged, with a bunch of license conditions which mean that they can't really integrate fully. And things have to kind of change. I'm not saying that there aren't risks attached to an individual's criminal kind of behavior, but so oftentimes the kind of punishments in place are just not working, and they're really about punishment and about this kind of retributive model of justice, which has been proven time and time again to be ineffective.
Well, I think too, this adds another level to the issues when people come home. If everything is about punishment, then you're just adding more to the pile rather than let's look at what brought you here and let's try to address that. And let's try to give you the tools and the abilities on handling things differently than you have in the past. And one of the things I think we really need to somehow do is reduce the fear of society. We make it look like everybody who is in prison are serial killers. They're going to come out and recidivate, that they're never going to be any different. Those types of fear tactics, I mean, really, we do it all the time, just even on the news. And that constant news, I would like to see end. Go ahead, mention the crime happened. You don't have to drag it through the news and the papers. And, you can say somebody went to prison, but I don't think the idea of just completely putting society in fear of every person who's in prison, because as you know, and as I know, there are fathers and sons and mothers, daughters that are in prison that have the possibility of coming out and living very good lives. And we need to take care of them while they're inside to prepare them for that, whether it be education, programming, counseling, peer support, drug programs. I guess what I'm saying is we need to change the archaic way we've been doing things for hundreds of years. We've done it the same way over and over again, and we're not getting good results from it. So we need to look at something different. And having a book like this, I think, coming out, not only just for the everyday person, but people who are in college. This is where I'm seeing now that more professors are addressing these issues and bringing to light what's happening within the correctional system, that, that we do need to make changes.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you, wholeheartedly. I think for me, part of the problem that you refer to there, which is this archaic way of doing justice, stems from a deep philosophical flaw in how justice, quote unquote. I increasingly feel uncomfortable using that word because if obviously all we know about justice systems, both in the UK, the US, and further afield, is that they represent injustice so often. But I think there's a deep philosophical flaw in the way that we traditionally kind of do corrections or whatever, and that is that when a crime occurs, it occurs in a community. There are a collection of community harms that happen as a consequence of crime, and nobody's denying that. But then what we do is we give this external powerful institution the responsibility of resolving the harm that took place in the community. So we kind of offload, as a society, sort of voluntarily, but with minimal idea of how it all works, we offload the community responsibility to this rapacious institution, which utilizes prison labor and does all of those things that we know are incredibly kind of shady. We give that institution the control and the responsibility of resolving what is a community issue, and when we do that, we mystify the process. We become confused about what happens. We don't know what the prison experience is like, but we're told through media reviews of prison that it's easy, it's a holiday camp, and it should be harder, and it should be this, that, and the other. And then, the general, the general kind of member of the population gets their ideas of justice from, fear mongering in the news media, and we get lost. When for me, really, the big questions are, how can we as communities take greater responsibility for crime as our problem, as a problem of interbeing, as a problem of interconnection that has been broken somehow, rather than continually giving the responsibility and the power of all of that to this institution, which takes control of it and keeps messing it up. And so for me, I think until we resolve that in some way, and until we get greater community buy-in, we're always going to see, recidivism rates fairly high. In the US, it's, as high as 77% within 2 years. I think, 72 gets quoted. I've seen 68 at the lower end. And in the UK, it's about 65% of people reoffend within 2 years. It's not working. And if that rate does come down, it might come down because of prison environments that are more conducive for education, more constructive. Norway is around 23%. Norway tops the tables for doing quite well, but that's still 1 in 4 people that reoffend within 2 years. And so for me, I think to get that down even more, we need to be looking at really diverting away from prison entirely. And we need to be looking at community-based programs which allow for, restoration, reform, or whatever in situ, in the space where the harm took place in the first instance. Now that sounds wild and radical to people, because they'll say, well, you can't do that. What if somebody's killed somebody, or what if somebody is dangerous? You can't just allow them to not go to prison. I understand that there are risks involved in not using prison, or not enclosing somebody who is inherently a risk. But there can be a different way of thinking about it, which involves the community a lot more. Even if individuals do have to be constrained, locked up for a period of time to keep people safe, how do we do that in a way that doesn't result in the media then telling us what happens about prison, and in a lot of fear-mongering and this kind of disconnected way that we kind of try to do justice? I think there are some inherent philosophical flaws with the way that we go about doing things.
So I think what you're talking about is like a restorative justice type program with the community coming in and bringing the person into the community again to try to restore the relationship, and rather than ostracizing that person when they come home.
Yeah, for sure. And if we look at where we're having the greatest success, I don't know if you know too much about Circles of Support and Accountability that began in Canada. So Circles is a community-based initiative which kind of relies on volunteers from the community. So 5 individuals volunteer, and they form a network, a supportive network around what they call the core member. The core member is the returning individual from prison. And the idea is that the community volunteers sort of provide a supportive network around the returning individual. And the aim is to help them combat some of the social obstacles that come with, leaving prison. So getting an ID document, applying for work, creating a resume, tackling homelessness, getting support for substance misuse, etc. So circles of support have been very effective at kind of enabling people to reintegrate, without recidivating. And other community-based programs have been very effective as well. The Prevention Project, has been revolutionary in Germany and in Nottingham in the UK. What we know, I think, from science is that when things work, they work because the community is involved. And they work because members of the community come together to deconstruct this kind of idea that individuals who've spent time in prison with convictions are inherently dangerous, evil, and whatever. And I think that in itself shows that If those programs are working better than any programs in prison, then we can gradually shift our focus from our reliance on prison as a response to crime towards community-based programs. But of course, I'm talking probably about centuries worth of work here. And I know that I'll sound kind of, naive, radical, unrealistic or whatever, but um, I think every time we set out to do research or we set out to develop a program or initiative, we should ask the question, is this moving towards abolishing prisons? Is this a step towards eventually abolishing prisons? We should at least ask that question. And if the answer is yes, we should continue with it. If it's definitely not, we probably shouldn't. So what that might allow us to do is, if we go about trying to improve a prison-based correctional program, is that moving towards abolishing prisons? Probably not. It's moving towards strengthening the prison as this kind of default institution for doing, justice. So I'm not sure that we should be, trying to reform and improve prisons. And I asked this question with my own research: is this moving towards abolishing prisons, peer support in prison, or is it strengthening it? Well, you could argue critically that actually no, it's just kind of allowing prisons to maintain themselves. But I would argue that no, what it's trying to do is, at least while we do have prison and there are a lot of people serving time, those individuals can, develop meaning, purpose from something that is altruistic and is benefiting them. But over time, we can also look to utilize peer support in a framework that doesn't involve the closed prison as we know it. So again, these are sort of debates for the ages and questions that we should, critically ask, in my view. But I know that they're very difficult.
Well, we've really covered some important items here today, for sure. With the prison abolition, I think there's a lot of us that once we go into this work and we get to know the people that are behind the bars, and we have a different understanding. And I think that's another thing is people, the only reason a person ever goes into a prison is if they're arrested or if they have a family member or friend they're going to visit. It's not, I think some of the colleges now are starting to take classrooms in, but in my opinion, you should not be working in any type of social services if you've never been inside of a jail or prison. That should be part of your education.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Valerie. I think, I mean, the sprawling harms, the sprawling social harms of prison and reincarceration on families and on generations are so vast and so embedded that I think you're right. I think that anybody in the social space working to resolve injustice should know about, what prisons are like, I think.
So now I'm going to catch you off guard. I'm going to ask you a question that I like to ask everybody. Has there been a book that has changed your life or really made a big impression on you?
Yeah, for sure. One of them, that's very connected to the space that I'm in is Shad Maruna's work. Shad Maruna is an eminent prof in criminology and an all-round wonderful guy. He wrote a book in 2001 called Making Good, how ex-offenders rebuild their lives. And it's just, one of those landmark texts which really digs into the narrative psychological experience of how people narrativize having committed a crime, but how they make sense of desisting from crime. And so it's a book really about how individuals seem to go through this kind of internal reworking of an internal dialogue about what crime kind of means to them and why they're desisting from crime. And so in that book, Shad really points to things like redemption rituals, how individuals have this desire to give back. He discusses wounded healers and talks a lot about peer support types of programs as well, and really kind of tees up a lot of research investigating the redemptive properties of things like active citizenship roles and roles whereby individuals get a chance to kind of undo the negative effects of labeling and ostracism and all the rest of it. So that's an incredible book, and it really is an insider perspective of what it is like to psychologically and sociologically navigate the experience of desisting from crime. Um, and then, more broadly, I am really kind of interested in philosophy. I read a lot of philosophy, and I would point to Albert Camus. I love reading Camus. Camus' work, The Outsider, is one of my favorite books. Another one is The Myth of Sisyphus. I use The Myth of Sisyphus quite a lot in the opening of my book to really highlight the fact that prison can be understood as a Sisyphean experience, this pushing of the rock up the hill, back down, the futile labor, the search for meaning despite, the universe's disinterest in providing any, presents a really kind of deprived and desperate context within which individuals try to, rescue themselves. And so, borrowing from a lot of those existential ideas of cultivating meaning, I'm really interested in applying, philosophies of absurdism and whatnot to the kind of criminological space. So yeah, Albert Camus. I could reel off a list really. I mean, I also love Simone de Beauvoir's, The Second Sex. Simone Weil's work on affliction. I read a lot of existentialism for sure. But yeah, in the criminology space, Shad Maruna's work. There's so many wonderful scholars out there, providing work in this space. So I will have omitted so many great, works, but yeah, I'll try and give you an answer.
I always like to ask that question because that's one thing that since I started doing prison work, I've always encouraged people to read. And some people, especially men, say, "Oh, I don't like to read." I
Yeah.
says, find something that's interesting to you. And they
Mm.
might be video games. Then read about the video games. Just
Yeah,
get in the
right.
habit of reading because, the more you read, the easier it becomes. And if you can read, you can do anything in this world. There isn't anything you cannot learn if you can read.
Yeah, it's so important. Yeah, one of the peer support programs that I interviewed people from was called Toe by Toe in the UK. Um, it's now called the Shannon Trust Program because the Shannon Trust is the charity that operates the program. But that was about prisoners teaching other prisoners to read, and so so important, to have that and to have the opportunity to be able to kind of read. But I agree with you. It's yeah, reading has been both a challenge and a struggle at times, and something that I've had to kind of endeavor through, and also a total kind of savior and a space of absolute enjoyment for me. Um, I mean, even novels that feel a bit guilty to confess to. Like one of my favorite books is The Beach by Alex Garland, which is pretty much a travel memoir. So it's kind of in that guilty category, but it's so much more than that as well. There's always so many metaphors within these books that you borrow from. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, a wonderful book again about the absurdity of war. So there are so many, but there's to name a few.
Okay, great. So, is there anything that we need to cover before we wrap things up? Did we leave anything out? How do people get in touch with you or find out more about your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to do a lot better on LinkedIn. It's fairly recent for me. I've been historically quite bad at using LinkedIn, but I'm using it more and more, and it seems to be the space for connecting people in this arena. So, yeah, LinkedIn. My email is c.s.perrin@bham.ac.uk, but that can be found easily. Googling my name, I guess, Dr. Christian Perrin, you should find some papers from me if you use Google Scholar. But yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I have an Instagram account as well, specific to my forensic work. I'm trying to do a bit more there, but I'm not sure how useful that space is. I'm on Twitter again, Dr. Christian Perrin. So, so yeah, for sure. People reach out, and I'm always looking to to have discussions about, this topic. And always looking to collaborate as well with people in the area of community-based reintegration programs or prevention programs. That's what I'm really interested in, I think. So,
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today to join us and talk with us because you're doing some fantastic work out there. And I love the idea of the peer support and writing about it. Um, and I really look forward to what you are going to be doing in the future because I think there's going to be some great things coming out of the UK.
yeah, for sure. Thank you, Valerie. I think for now I'm quite focused on a number of projects that are ongoing. I'm working with uh, Stephen again on a project looking to kind of instill peer support programs in Maine. And we'll see kind of where that's going. That's going to be slow build. And I'm going to continue working with the Awaken Exchange. I'm working with Ron Garrett, Dr. Ron Garrett, on his experience of a therapeutic community prison in Georgia. So we'll be kind of publishing some research on therapeutic community prisons, again with the intention of moving away from the prison as that traditional that institution of punishment, that instrument that punishes. And I'll be working on a few reintegration programs as well and trying to kind of develop the research base for those, not least of which circles of support and accountability. We're looking to utilize those in more and more regions in the UK. Hopefully, we can continue bit by bit to make impact in this space, which can often seem, really intransigent or stuck. But hey, we just got to try to keep on doing what we can, I suppose.
Keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, if you would hold on for just a moment once we wrap things up to make sure everything uploads, that would be great.
Sure.
I want to thank Christian Perrin for joining us today on the Prison Pod. For all of you, this actually wraps up this season. So I will be taking 3 months off to focus on the death row recordings coming up and the North Carolina Field Ministers. So I'll be back in the fall with a whole new season of the Prison Pod.
You have been listening to the Prison Pod, a podcast not just for those in prison but for anyone who has been affected by incarceration. Ms. Valerie would love for you to write to her with your questions, comments, and show ideas. The address is Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine. 04473.